Hey everyone, I wanted to welcome you to week 2 of English 300. And what we're going to do in today's lecture is we're going to talk about the next step in understanding how rhetoric and argument works. So I've read all your discussion board questions, and I love how class has defined rhetoric. You know, there are many various definitions. The one common link that I notice many students like to use is they like to use the word persuade as part of their definition. So even though many students are using the word persuade, as of week 2, I'm still going to maintain my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is still going to be words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And in today's lecture, I'm going to talk about the next step in helping us understand rhetoric and argument. So what you might want to do is you might want to take our St. Martin's Handbook, and you might want to read over pages like 142 to 147, kind of talk about some of the terms that I'm going to talk about today. So if you want to read those over, they might give you a little bit of better understanding of how rhetoric and argument works. But rhetoric and argument essentially use three things. They use logos, pathos, and ethos. So I want to talk about these three terms. So the first one, rhetoric and argument will always use logos. And if I was in a ground class, I sort of write these three terms on the board and I ask students, what do you think these words mean just by either seeing them or looking at them? So most students can look at the word logos. They look at it, it kind of sounds like, and most students can guess logic. So logos is an appeal to logic. Now these are terms that the Greeks and the Romans use. But anyway, so logos is an appeal to logic, which would make sense because if you want to accept that one definition of rhetoric might be the ability to persuade, well then that would make sense because we would want to use logic to persuade. Sometimes students think that logos might be facts. And notice if you're going to use facts in an argument, then that would make sense that you'd want to use logic. So logos is an appeal to logic. The second term is pathos. And pathos is an appeal to emotion. And so it would make sense if you want to accept my definition of rhetoric as words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people, well, that would make sense because you're going to want to appeal to someone's base emotions. We're all emotional beings, so it would make sense that you might want to appeal to someone's emotion. I always try to remember some sort of mnemonic to remember that pathos is emotion, to think of that it starts with P. So pathos is emotion because people are passionate, right? Or pleasure. So I try to associate the P to associate emotion so students can remember that pathos is emotion. The last term the last thing that rhetoric and argument uses is ethos. And ethos, even though it looks like emotion, we want to remember that pathos is emotion. So ethos can be really defined as two things. It can be defined as character or authority, and then sometimes it's defined as ethics or morals. I will never define ethos as ethics or morals because in my English 302 class, we look at some arguments that specifically deal with the moral and ethical issue. So I will appeal I'd sort of talk about ethos in terms of character or authority. And so sometimes students are confused about what do we mean by ethos, someone's character or authority. And I always use the example with students. Imagine that you could have this online class taught by an instructor who taught at Harvard or Yale, right? And someone who teaches at Harvard or Yale has a really great character, right? Harvard being one of the greatest universities, if not the greatest university in the nation, right? So someone who has like this character or ethos teaching a class at Harvard would have a lot of credibility and authority. And it's funny because sometimes I pose that to students and sometimes students are saying, I wouldn't want to have an instructor taught at Harvard because the ethos of an instructor who teaches at Harvard or Yale is one that's really hard and sort of is intimidating for students. So I just want you to think about these three terms. So we now know that rhetoric and argument use three things. Logos, which is an appeal to logic. Pathos, which is an appeal to emotion. And ethos, which is character or authority, or sometimes can be referred to as ethics. And what you're going to do is there's another video you can watch that might give you a little bit better understanding. And afterwards, there's a discussion board. And then there's an essay at the end of the week where I just want you to think about how these terms might work. So I look forward to what you have to say during the week. Keep up the good week in week 2, and I think it's going to be fun.